Heavenly Father, I pray for everyone watching this video right now. May you bless them with peace, joy, and breakthroughs in their lives. Amen. Hello, my wonderful family. I am so glad and grateful to have you here with me today. Your support means the world, and I truly don't take it for granted. Before we dive into today's powerful story, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, drop a comment below to share your thoughts, and of course, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update from this channel. Sign the papers, Alexander, and 30,000 families lose their homes by Christmas. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, but Alexander Kane felt nothing. Not the weight of those lives, not the moral implications, not even satisfaction at the profit margins. Just emptiness. The same hollow void that had lived in his chest for so long he'd forgotten what feeling anything else was like. The shareholders are waiting, his assistant pressed, sliding the foreclosure documents closer across the mahogany desk. Alexander stared at the papers, his pen suspended inches above the signature line. 30,000 families. The number should mean something. Should trigger guilt, remorse, even sadistic pleasure. Instead, it felt like reading statistics about weather patterns in countries he'd never visit. When did I become this? The thought surprised him with its clarity. When did I stop being human? Sir? The assistant's voice carried a note of concern. Alexander Kane never hesitated, never questioned, never showed weakness. Welcome to a story that will shatter everything you thought you knew about love, redemption, and the price of emotional survival. I'm about to take you on a journey that proves sometimes the coldest hearts hide the deepest capacity for love, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Alexander's hand trembled slightly, the first physical emotion he'd displayed in months. The tremor sent a shock through him more powerful than any business victory ever had. I'm still capable of feeling something. Cancel my appointments for the day, he heard himself say, the words seeming to come from someone else entirely. Sir, the board meeting. Cancel everything. Alexander stood abruptly, the chair rolling backward with sudden violence. I need to think. He strode toward the elevator, his assistant's protests fading behind him. The foreclosure papers remained unsigned on his desk. The first time in a decade Alexander Kane had failed to execute a profitable decision. 37 floors down, the city streets assaulted him with noise, smells, and chaos he usually observed only from climate-controlled heights. The December wind cut through his wool coat, and for once, he didn't immediately retreat to warmth and comfort. The cold felt real, more real than anything in his sterile office. Alexander walked without destination, letting his feet carry him away from the financial district into neighborhoods where his company's influence had carved deep wounds. Boarded windows. For lease signs. Empty lots where apartment buildings once stood. I did this. The realization hit him like physical pain. I created this wasteland. He turned a corner and stopped dead. A girl sat on the sidewalk ahead, her back against a brick wall covered in graffiti that read, Kane Corp Kills Communities. She couldn't have been more than 22, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing that couldn't hide her delicate bone structure or the way she cradled something protectively in her arms. As Alexander approached, he saw what she was protecting, a small, hand-drawn portrait. Even from a distance, the artistic skill was evident. The subject was an elderly woman with kind eyes and laugh lines, rendered with the sort of love that made each pencil stroke a prayer. Excuse me, Alexander found himself saying, his voice rusty from disuse in normal conversation. The girl looked up, and Alexander's world tilted off its axis. Her eyes held something he'd forgotten existed, hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone begging for scraps, but the quiet, unshakable hope of someone who still believed in goodness despite evidence to the contrary. Her face was gaunt from hunger, her clothes threadbare, but her eyes were alive in a way that made Alexander realize his own had been dead for years. Are you okay? She asked softly, studying his face with genuine concern. The question was so unexpected, so purely human, that Alexander actually stepped backward. When was the last time someone had asked about his well-being without wanting something from him? When was the last time anyone had looked at him and seen a person rather than a bank account? Alexander's throat constricted. I should be asking you that. She smiled then, and the expression transformed her entire face. I have everything I need right here, she said, glancing down at the portrait. This is my grandmother. She passed last month, but I draw her every day so I don't forget her voice. Alexander stared at the simple pencil drawing, worth nothing in monetary terms but obviously priceless to its creator. "You're an artist?" "I try to be." She held up her pencil stub, barely 2 inches long, worn down to nothing. "Though my supplies are running a bit low." Something cracked inside Alexander's chest, a hairline fracture in the ice that had encased his heart for decades. This girl owned nothing, had lost everything, lived on the street in December cold, and yet she spoke with more genuine contentment than he'd heard from billionaires discussing their latest acquisitions. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma." She tilted her head, studying him with artist's eyes. "You look sad. Really deeply sad. Like you're carrying something heavy." How does she see that? Alexander had perfected the art of emotional invisibility. Poker face. Corporate mask. The impenetrable armor of successful indifference. "I'm not sad," he said automatically. Emma's expression grew gentle. "You don't have to pretend with me. I don't want anything from you, so you can just be whoever you really are." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Be whoever you really are. When was the last time anyone had given him permission to drop the mask? When was the last time he'd even remembered who existed underneath it? Alexander began, then stopped. "Who am I?" The question terrified him because he genuinely didn't know the answer. Emma waited patiently, not pushing, just offering space for truth in a world that had taught Alexander that honesty was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I think I might have forgotten how to feel anything," Alexander admitted, the words scraping his throat raw. "Feeling is like drawing," Emma said thoughtfully. "If you don't practice, your hand gets stiff. But the ability never really goes away. It just needs encouragement." Alexander stared at this girl who had nothing but offered wisdom like it was water to someone dying of thirst. How do you still have hope?" Emma glanced around at the urban decay surrounding them, then back at her grandmother's portrait. "Because giving up hope would dishonor everyone who loved me enough to believe I was worth saving. And even if I never find my way out of this, maybe I can help someone else find theirs." The fracture in Alexander's chest widened, letting in light for the first time in years. This girl, this homeless, penniless, forgotten girl, possessed something his billions couldn't buy. She had purpose, connection, love that transcended material loss. "Emma," Alexander said quietly, "would you let me buy you lunch?" She studied his face carefully. "Why?" Because talking to you is the first time I've felt human in a decade. Because your hope is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Because I think you might be the key to finding whoever I used to be before I became this empty shell. Because I think you might be hungry," he said instead. Emma smiled again, and Alexander felt another crack appear in the ice around his heart. "Okay, but somewhere cheap. I don't want you spending money you can't afford." Alexander almost laughed, the bitter, ironic sound catching in his throat. If only you knew. But something told him that revealing his wealth now would shatter this fragile moment of genuine human connection. "I know a place," he said, thinking of a small diner he'd noticed but never entered. As Emma carefully tucked her grandmother's portrait into her jacket and stood, Alexander caught sight of something that made his blood freeze. Pinned to her backpack was a newspaper clipping, a photo of families being evicted from their apartments. The headline read, "Kane Corp evictions leave hundreds homeless before holidays." Emma followed his gaze and saw what he was looking at. "Oh, that. I keep it as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Alexander's voice came out strangled. "That some people have so much money they forget other people are human." Emma's voice carried no anger, just infinite sadness. "I hope someday he remembers that every signature affects real lives. Maybe if he could see faces instead of numbers, he'd make different choices." Alexander stared at the clipping, understanding with crystal clarity that Emma had no idea who he was. To her, he was just another person on the street. Not Alexander Kane, corporate destroyer, but simply someone who looked sad and might need a friend. The irony was devastating. The one person who'd shown him genuine kindness in years was someone whose life he'd likely destroyed through his business decisions. Someone who carried his victims' stories as motivation to maintain hope and humanity. What have I become? The question echoed in his mind as Emma began walking toward the diner, trusting him completely despite having every reason to trust no one. Alexander followed, each step feeling like walking toward either his salvation or his destruction. The unsigned foreclosure papers seemed to burn in his memory. 30,000 more families who would join the ranks of people like Emma if he didn't find a way to become human again. But as Emma glanced back at him with that radiant smile, Alexander realized something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. For the first time in his adult life, profit margins seemed less important than the light in someone's eyes. The cold millionaire CEO who had never loved anyone was about to discover that love, real, transformative, soul-shattering love, had been waiting for him in the last place he would ever think to look. And Emma, the girl who saw hope in everyone, was about to fall for the one man whose identity could destroy them both. The diner smelled like coffee that had been brewing since the 1980s and dreams that had been deferred even longer. Alexander slid into a cracked vinyl booth across from Emma, acutely aware that he'd never sat in a restaurant where the menu was laminated and the seats weren't reserved under his name. 2 coffees and whatever she wants to eat, Alexander told the waitress, a woman whose weathered face suggested she'd seen every type of human story pass through these doors. I'll just have soup, Emma said softly. Whatever's cheapest. The waitress, her name tag read Dolores, studied Alexander with the sharp eyes of someone who'd learned to read people for survival. You're not from around here, are you, honey? Alexander's throat tightened. Even without knowing his identity, people could sense he didn't belong in places where genuine human connection happened. No, I'm exploring new neighborhoods. Dolores's expression warmed toward Emma. Soup's on the house, sweetheart. And I'll bring some bread. She turned back to Alexander with subtle warning in her voice. Coffee's $3.50. Cash only. As Dolores walked away, Alexander realized he was experiencing something foreign, being judged not by his bank account or corporate reputation, but by his character. And apparently he was failing the test. She's protective, Emma explained, misreading his expression. There are men who come here sometimes, looking for girls like me. Girls with nowhere else to go. Her voice carried no self-pity, just matter-of-fact awareness of danger. The casual way Emma mentioned predators made Alexander's hands clench into fists. Has anyone ever tried to hurt you? Why do you think I sleep in different places every night? Emma's smile was sad but not defeated. The world isn't safe for invisible people. But it's taught me to recognize the difference between someone who wants to help and someone who wants to take. Which am I? Alexander asked, genuinely uncertain. Emma studied his face with those impossibly clear eyes. I think you're someone who's forgotten how to help anyone, including yourself. But you want to remember. How does she see me so clearly? Alexander had built his entire adult life around being unreadable, unpredictable, untouchable. Yet this girl dissected his soul like she was reading a children's book. Tell me about your grandmother, Alexander said, desperate to shift focus away from his own transparency. Emma's entire demeanor transformed, love radiating from her like warmth from a fire. Grandma Rose raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 8. She was a seamstress, could make anything beautiful with just thread and determination. As Emma spoke, Alexander found himself leaning forward, drawn into a story that contained more genuine wealth than most corporate acquisition tales. She taught me that art isn't about having expensive supplies. It's about seeing beauty where others see ordinary things. She'd give me old receipts and napkins to draw on, saying the message matters more than the canvas. Dolores returned with steaming bowls and a basket of bread that looked suspiciously larger than necessary. As Emma wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, Alexander noticed her hands. Delicate but calloused, with paint stains under her fingernails despite having no money for art supplies. She sounds extraordinary, Alexander said, meaning it. She was. Even when the cancer got bad, she'd sit up with me drawing pictures of all the places we'd travel someday. Paris, Rome, the Scottish Highlands. Emma's voice caught slightly. She died 3 days before I was supposed to start art school. The scholarship covered tuition, but not living expenses and the funeral costs. I lost the apartment, dropped out, and ended up here. Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The desire to fix someone else's pain. There must be other scholarships. Other programs. Maybe. Emma's shrug carried years of disappointment. But I'm 23 now. Most opportunities are for younger students. And without an address, applying for anything is complicated. The casual way Emma dismissed her dreams made Alexander's chest ache. Here was someone with obvious talent and unlimited potential, defeated not by lack of ability, but by systemic barriers designed to keep the powerless exactly where they were. Barriers I helped create. The thought hit him like ice water. What about you? Emma asked, pulling him from his self-recrimination. What do you do? Alexander's coffee turned to ash in his mouth. I work in finance. Asterisk technically true. Completely misleading. Asterisk the half-truth felt like swallowing broken glass. That sounds stable, Emma said with genuine warmth. Security is important. I bet your parents are proud. My parents are dead. The words came out harsher than Alexander intended. Emma's expression immediately softened. I'm sorry. How old were you? 16. Alexander stared into his coffee, memories surfacing like corpses in dark water. Car accident, just like yours. But I had a trust fund, boarding school, lawyers managing everything until I turned 18. That must have been incredibly lonely. The simple observation cracked something fundamental in Alexander's chest. Lonely. Yes. 16 years old, orphaned, surrounded by people paid to care for him, but no one who actually did. He'd learned early that money could buy everything except genuine human connection. I survived, Alexander said, the automatic response he'd given therapists, lawyers, and anyone else who'd tried to excavate his emotional archaeology. Surviving isn't the same as living, Emma said quietly. When did I stop living? Alexander traced the moment backward. The first business decision that required emotional detachment. The first time empathy became expensive. The gradual calcification of his heart until feeling anything seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. After my parents died, I decided emotions were inefficient, Alexander admitted. They complicated decisions, made me vulnerable. And now, Alexander looked at Emma's face, soft with compassion for someone she'd known less than 2 hours, and felt decades of careful emotional armor cracking. Now I'm sitting in a diner with someone who's lost everything but still offers kindness to strangers, and I'm wondering if I made the wrong choice. Emma reached across the table and touched his hand gently. The contact sent electricity through Alexander's entire nervous system. Not sexual attraction, though that was certainly present, but something deeper. Recognition. Soul calling to soul across an ocean of accumulated damage. It's never too late to choose differently, Emma said. Alexander stared at their joined hands, his manicured and soft from a life of comfort, hers rough and paint-stained from survival and art, and felt the earth shift beneath his feet. This girl believed in redemption. Believed people could change. Believed he could change. What if she's right? Emma. Alexander's voice came out rough with amused emotion. What if someone had done terrible things? Hurt people without meaning to? Would you still think they could change? Emma's eyes searched his face. I think people do terrible things when they're in terrible pain. But pain isn't an excuse, it's an explanation. The question isn't whether someone can change. It's whether they want to badly enough to do the work. Do I want to badly enough? Alexander had spent so many years viewing personal transformation as corporate weakness that the possibility of genuine change felt like learning a foreign language. The work, he asked. Admitting what you've done. Making amends where you can. Choosing differently going forward, even when it costs you something. Alexander's phone buzzed against his chest. Undoubtedly his assistant, demanding he return to sign the foreclosure papers. 30,000 families hung in the balance while he sat in a diner holding hands with a homeless girl who believed in his capacity for goodness. The cosmic irony was suffocating. I should probably get going, Alexander said reluctantly, though every instinct screamed at him to stay in this bubble where Emma looked at him like he was worth saving. Of course. Emma started to withdraw her hand, but Alexander caught it gently. Would you let me see you again? Emma's smile was radiant. I'd like that. I'm usually at Washington Square Park in the afternoons, sketching people. Tomorrow. Alexander pulled out his wallet to pay, and Emma's eyes widened at the thickness of cash visible inside. He quickly extracted a 20 and closed it, but her expression had already shifted, not to greed or calculation, but to confusion. That's a lot of money for someone in finance, she said carefully. First crack in the foundation. Alexander's heart rate spiked. I do okay. Alexander. Emma's voice carried new wariness. What kind of finance? Before Alexander could answer, the diner door chimed and a man in an expensive suit walked in, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Alexander. The man's face went through a series of rapid expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally recognition. Mr. Kane. The man approached their table with obvious nervousness. Sir, your assistant has been trying to reach you. The board is waiting for. Not now. Alexander cut him off sharply, but the damage was done. Emma's face went white. Kane, she whispered. Alexander watched in real time as Emma's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to horror. Her eyes darted to the newspaper clipping pinned to her backpack, then back to his face. "You're Alexander Kane," she said, her voice barely audible. "Kane Corporation. You're Emma, I can explain. You're the one who destroyed my neighborhood." Emma's voice gained strength as understanding dawned. The evictions, the foreclosures, the families thrown out of their homes. She stood abruptly, backing away from the table. "You're the reason half the people on the streets are there." "I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" "That your decisions affected real people." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice carried steel. "Or you didn't know one of your victims would be naive enough to show you kindness?" Alexander stood, reaching for her. "Please let me explain. This isn't what it looks like." "Isn't it?" Emma pulled the newspaper clipping from her backpack and held it up. "Is this your signature on the eviction orders? Did you or did you not make millions while destroying communities?" Alexander's silence was answer enough. "I told you about my grandmother's death," Emma said, her voice breaking. "About losing everything. About ending up on the streets. And the whole time you knew. You knew you were partly responsible, and you said nothing. I wanted to tell you." "When?" "After you'd gotten whatever entertainment you wanted from playing with the poor girl? After you'd satisfied your curiosity about how the other half lives." The accusation hit Alexander like a physical blow because part of it was true. He had been curious about her world, fascinated by her resilience, drawn to her authenticity like a man dying of thirst toward water. "It wasn't like that," Alexander said desperately. "Then what was it like?" Emma's tears finally spilled over. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the man who spent years treating people like numbers just spent an afternoon treating me like his personal redemption project." Alexander wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in his throat. Because wasn't that exactly what he'd been doing? Using her hope, her kindness, her belief in human goodness to make himself feel better about a lifetime of emotional emptiness? "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered. "I don't want your apology," Emma said. "I want you to sign whatever papers you came here to avoid signing, go back to your tower, and pretend this conversation never happened. Just like you pretend all your victims don't exist." Emma turned and walked toward the door, each step widening the chasm between them. "Emma, wait," Alexander called. She paused at the door without turning around. "You know what the saddest part is? For a minute there, I actually thought you might be different. I thought maybe underneath all that money and power, there was someone worth knowing." "There is," Alexander said desperately. "You saw him. You brought him back to life." Emma turned back, and the expression on her face nearly destroyed him. Not anger, but infinite sadness. "No. I saw who you could have been. Who you maybe were before you chose to become this. But that person died a long time ago, didn't he? And no amount of kindness from people like me can resurrect someone who doesn't want to be saved." With that, Emma walked out of the diner and out of Alexander's life, leaving him standing among the wreckage of the first genuine human connection he'd made in decades. The man in the expensive suit cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir?" "The board meeting." Alexander stared at the door Emma had disappeared through, understanding with crystalline clarity that he stood at a crossroads. He could return to his tower, sign the foreclosure papers, and continue his life of profitable emptiness. Or he could try to become the man Emma had seen in him, the man he'd forgotten he could be. But first, he had to decide if 30,000 families mattered more than his shareholders' profits. And if one homeless girl's opinion of his soul was worth losing everything he'd spent his life building. Alexander stood in the diner's aftermath like a man surveying the wreckage of his own soul. The other patrons had returned to their conversations, but Dolores watched him with eyes that had seen this exact moment before. The precise instant when someone realizes they've lost something irreplaceable. "You gonna chase after her, or you gonna stand there bleeding all over my floor?" Dolores asked, refilling his untouched coffee. "She's right about me," Alexander said quietly. "Everything she said. I am exactly what she thinks I am." "Maybe." Dolores studied him with unsympathetic clarity. "But seems to me you got a choice to make. You can be what you've always been, or you can be what she saw in you. But you can't be both." Alexander's phone buzzed insistently. 17 missed calls from his assistant. The board meeting. The foreclosure papers. 30,000 families waiting for his signature to destroy their lives. What Emma saw in me. The memory of her touch, her belief in his capacity for goodness, burned in his chest like swallowed fire. Alexander pulled out his phone and dialed. Mr. Kane. Thank God. Where are you? The board is. Tell the board the Riverside foreclosure project is cancelled, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. Silence. Then, sir, I don't understand. The profit projections. Cancel it. All of it. Find another way to meet quarterly projections that doesn't involve destroying communities. Mr. Kane, with respect, you can't make this decision unilaterally. The board won't. Then call an emergency meeting. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Alexander hung up and turned to leave, but Dolores caught his arm. That girl, she said quietly. She comes in here every few days. Orders soup, tips with quarters, draws pictures on napkins for my granddaughter. She ain't just homeless, honey. She's special. And if you're planning on turning her life into some rich man's redemption story, you better think real hard about whether you're doing it for her or for yourself. The words hit Alexander like a slap. How do I know the difference? When you're willing to lose everything for her happiness instead of gaining everything from her forgiveness. Alexander nodded slowly, understanding settling in his bones like gravity. This wasn't about winning Emma back. This was about becoming someone worthy of the faith she'd shown him, even if she never spoke to him again. But first, he had to survive what he was about to do to his own empire. 23 minutes later, Alexander walked into the Kane Corp boardroom to find 12 faces staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to barely contained fury. At the head of the table sat Richard Blackstone, his business partner and the man who'd turned Kane Corp from a modest family business into a multinational destroyer of communities. Alexander. Blackstone's voice carried the dangerous calm of a predator sizing up prey. I think there's been some miscommunication. Your assistant seems to think you want to cancel the Riverside project. No miscommunication. Alexander took his seat, acutely aware that he was about to detonate his entire life. The project is cancelled. The boardroom erupted in simultaneous protests, but Blackstone's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Gentlemen, please. The room fell silent. Alexander, perhaps you'd like to explain your reasoning. Because from where I sit, you're suggesting we voluntarily forfeit $800 million in profit. Alexander looked around the table at faces he'd known for years. Men and women who'd helped him build an empire, who'd trusted him with their investments, their careers, their futures. In their eyes, he saw the same calculation he'd perfected. Profit above all else, efficiency over empathy, success at any cost. I used to be exactly like them. The Riverside project displaces 30,000 families 3 weeks before Christmas, Alexander said. We're essentially creating homelessness for profit. Board member Patricia Voss leaned forward. Alexander, we've been through this. These are market-rate properties in appreciating neighborhoods. If we don't develop them, someone else will. At least we're offering relocation assistance. $3,000 per family to find new housing in a city where average rent is $4,000 a month, Alexander countered. We're not offering assistance. We're offering a cruel joke. Since when do you care about the social implications of development? Blackstone's question carried genuine curiosity, mixed with something darker. You personally design the efficiency models that maximize displacement for minimum compensation. The accusation landed like a physical blow because it was completely true. Alexander had spent years perfecting the mathematics of human suffering, finding ways to extract maximum profit from minimal investment in people's lives. People change, Alexander said quietly. In the span of one afternoon? Blackstone's laugh was cold. What happened, Alexander? Did you suddenly develop a conscience? I met someone who still has one. But Alexander couldn't say that without sounding like exactly what Emma had accused him of being. A rich man treating the poor like his personal redemption project. I met someone who helped me remember that our decisions affect real people, Alexander said instead. Ah! Blackstone's expression shifted to something predatory. A woman. How unexpected. The way Blackstone said woman made Alexander's skin crawl. This isn't about. Of course it is. Blackstone stood, beginning to pace around the table like a shark scenting blood. You meet some idealistic girl, she challenges your worldview, and suddenly you want to throw away everything we've built. It's almost touching in its predictability. Richard. No, I think the board deserves to know exactly what's happening here. Blackstone's voice gained theatrical weight. Our CEO has apparently fallen for someone who's convinced him that business success and moral clarity are mutually exclusive. Alexander felt the room's energy shift. These people had known him for years as the coldest, most ruthlessly efficient businessman in the city. The idea that emotion could compromise his judgment was their worst nightmare made manifest. "Tell me, Alexander," Blackstone continued, "what happens when this mystery woman realizes that your capacity for grand gestures is directly proportional to your bank account? What happens when she discovers that your newly awakened conscience is funded by decades of exactly the behavior you're now condemning?" The words hit Alexander like ice water because they echoed Emma's accusations with surgical precision. Was he trying to buy forgiveness with grand gestures? Was his sudden moral awakening just another form of emotional manipulation? This isn't about her, Alexander said, though his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Blackstone pulled out his phone and swiped to a photo that made Alexander's blood freeze. It was a picture of him and Emma in the diner, deep in conversation, her hand touching his across the table. "Richard, how did you? I had you followed when you disappeared today. Standard security protocol." Blackstone's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Emma Hartwell, 23, homeless since age 18, grandmother died of cancer, lost her apartment too. He paused dramatically. Kane Corp evictions 3 months ago. The room went dead silent. "You're telling me," board member James Liu said slowly, "that you want to cancel an $800 million project because you've fallen for one of our own eviction victims?" Alexander felt the walls closing in. Every word he'd spoken to Emma, every moment of connection, every flash of hope he'd felt about becoming a better person suddenly looked exactly like what Blackstone was suggesting. The predictable infatuation of a rich man with his own victim. But it wasn't like that. Or was it? How could he trust his own motivations when they'd led him to construct such an elaborate emotional deception? "The project is cancelled," Alexander repeated, his voice stronger now. "Not because of Emma Hartwell. Because it's wrong." "Wrong?" Blackstone laughed. "According to whom? Your newfound conscience? The same moral compass that's been missing for 15 years of business decisions. According to basic human decency. Decency doesn't pay shareholders dividends, Alexander. Decency doesn't fund the pension plans of our employees. Decency doesn't maintain the lifestyle that allows you to play savior to homeless girls in the first place." The brutal logic was unassailable. Everything Alexander owned, everything that gave him the power to help anyone, was built on exactly the kind of decisions he was now trying to unmake. "I'll find another way to meet projections," Alexander said. "There is no other way." Blackstone's voice gained finality. "We've spent 18 months positioning for the Riverside development. Our entire quarterly outlook depends on it. You cancel this project, and Kane Corp stock drops 30% overnight. Then it drops. 2,000 employees lose their jobs when the stock price triggers our debt obligations. 40,000 retirees see their pensions evaporate. But sure, let's sacrifice them all so you can feel better about disappointing one homeless girl." Alexander felt the trap closing around him with mathematical precision. Save 30,000 families by destroying 40,000 retirees. Choose between different groups of innocent people while the real villains, himself and Blackstone, remained insulated from consequences. "There has to be another option," Alexander said desperately. "There is." Blackstone's voice grew silky. "You sign the papers, we proceed as planned, and you use your considerable personal wealth to set up a private foundation for Ms. Hartwell. Give her everything she needs: housing, art school, a comfortable life. Problem solved." The offer hung in the air like poison honey. Alexander could save face with the board, protect the company's employees and retirees, and give Emma everything she'd lost. All he had to do was accept that some injustices were too big to fix and focus on the people he could actually help. It's the smart choice. The practical choice. The choice that helps the most people. But even as Alexander tried to convince himself, he could hear Emma's voice. Some people have so much money they forget other people are human. Buying Emma's forgiveness with a foundation wouldn't make him human again. It would just make him a more sophisticated version of the same monster. "No," Alexander said quietly. "No." Blackstone's eyebrows rose. "I'm not signing the papers. Find another way to meet projections, or don't. But we're not displacing 30,000 families for profit." The boardroom erupted again, but Blackstone's voice cut through the chaos with surgical calm. "Then you leave me no choice." He pressed a button on the conference table, and the room's screens lit up with legal documents. "Emergency board resolution," Blackstone announced. Motion to remove Alexander Kane as CEO due to emotional compromise affecting fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Alexander stared at the screens, understanding flooding through him like ice water. You planned this. I planned for every contingency, Blackstone said, including the possibility that success might eventually make you soft. The board has been prepared for this moment for months. You can't. I can. And I will. Blackstone's expression shifted to something almost pitying. You were the best business partner I ever had, Alexander. Cold, brilliant, utterly ruthless. But the moment you started feeling again, you became a liability. Alexander looked around the table at faces he'd trusted, people he'd considered allies, and saw nothing but calculation. They'd already made their choice. The vote was a formality. All in favor? Blackstone asked. 11 hands rose instantly. Motion carries. Alexander Kane is hereby removed as CEO of Kane Corp., effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. As if summoned by magic, 2 security guards appeared at the boardroom door. Alexander stood slowly, the magnitude of what had just happened settling around him like lead. In the space of one day, he'd lost his company, his fortune, his identity, and the only person who'd ever seen goodness in him. But as the security guards approached, Alexander realized something that surprised him. He wasn't devastated. He was relieved. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't have to carry the weight of other people's suffering on his business decisions. He didn't have to calculate the profit margins of human misery. He didn't have to choose between his conscience and his shareholders. There's just one problem with your plan, Richard, Alexander said as the guards flanked him. What's that? You forgot that I still own 42% of Kane Corp stock. And as of 5 minutes ago, when you removed me as CEO without cause, I can trigger the dissolution clause in our partnership agreement. Blackstone's face went white. You wouldn't. Watch me. Alexander smiled for the first time in hours. I may not be able to stop the Riverside project, but I can make sure you go down with the ship you're determined to sail. If you trigger dissolution, everyone in this room loses everything. Everyone in this room just voted to destroy my life. Seems like fair play. Alexander turned toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Richard? You were wrong about one thing. This isn't about trying to impress Emma. She made it very clear she wants nothing to do with me. This is about trying to become someone I can live with when I look in the mirror. As the security guards escorted Alexander from the building that had been his second home for 15 years, his phone rang. Emma's number. Alexander's heart stopped. She's calling me back. Hello. Alexander. Emma's voice was thick with tears. I need help. Someone broke into my shelter space. They destroyed everything, my drawings, my grandmother's portrait, everything. And there was a note. What kind of note? It says stay away from Kane, or next time it won't just be your things. Alexander felt the world tilt sideways. Where are you? Washington Square Park. Alexander, I'm scared. Who would do this? How do they even know about us? Alexander closed his eyes, understanding with horrible clarity what had happened. Blackstone hadn't just had him followed. He'd identified Emma as a potential weakness and taken steps to eliminate her influence. I'm coming, Alexander said. Stay where there are people. Don't go anywhere alone. Alexander, what's happening? Who would threaten me just for talking to you? People who know I've fallen in love with you and want to use that against me. But Alexander couldn't say that, couldn't burden Emma with the knowledge that caring about him had made her a target. I'll explain everything when I get there, Alexander said. Just please be safe. As Alexander hung up and started running toward the park, he realized that losing his company was only the beginning. Blackstone had just declared war, and Emma was caught in the crossfire. The cold millionaire CEO who had never loved anyone was about to discover that love was the most dangerous emotion of all, because it gave your enemies the perfect weapon to destroy you. And Emma, the girl who believed in redemption, was about to learn that some people would burn the world down before they'd let others find salvation. Alexander found Emma huddled on a park bench, clutching a torn piece of paper like it might dissolve if she loosened her grip. The winter afternoon cast long shadows through the bare trees, and even from a distance he could see her shaking. Emma. Alexander approached slowly, hands visible, moving like someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. She looked up, and the relief in her eyes nearly broke him. Despite everything, his lies, his identity, the devastation his company had caused her life, she was still glad to see him. They took everything, Emma whispered, holding up the threatening note. Even the last sketch I had of Grandma Rose. It's like they wanted to erase her completely. Alexander sat beside her, close enough to offer warmth, but far enough to respect the fragile trust between them. Let me see the note. The paper was expensive, the kind of heavy-stock Blackstone preferred for corporate correspondence. The message was printed in standard computer font, designed to be untraceable, but Alexander recognized the psychological precision. Asterisk, stay away from Kane, or next time it won't just be your things. Asterisk. This is about me, Alexander said quietly. Someone's trying to hurt you to get to me. But why? Emma's voice carried exhausted confusion. You said you work in finance. Who threatens homeless people over finance? Alexander felt the weight of his deceptions settling around them like a noose. Every lie he'd told to protect this moment had only made the inevitable truth more devastating. Emma, there are things about my work, about who I am in the business world, that I didn't tell you. More things. Emma's laugh was hollow. Alexander, I already know you're the CEO who's destroyed half the city's affordable housing. What could be worse than that? Former CEO. But before Alexander could explain about the board coup, his phone rang. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Kane Corp Security. Don't answer it, Emma said quickly, reading his expression. I have to. This might be about the threats against you. Alexander answered, putting the call on speaker. This is Alexander. Mr. Kane. The voice was crisp, professional, terrifying in its neutrality. This is Director Walsh from Kane Corp Security. I'm calling to inform you that your personal security detail has been terminated, effective immediately. What security detail? The one that's been protecting Ms. Hartwell for the past 3 months. Alexander and Emma stared at each other in shock. I never authorized. Mr. Blackstone did. Apparently, he was concerned about potential threats to anyone in your social circle. The detail was instructed to remain invisible unless Ms. Hartwell was in immediate danger. Blackstone had Emma watched for 3 months. Alexander felt reality reshaping itself around him. Why are you telling me this? Because as of 1 hour ago, that protection is gone. Ms. Hartwell is now completely exposed to whatever threats Mr. Blackstone was protecting her from. The line went dead. Emma's face had gone white. Someone's been watching me for 3 months? Emma, I swear I didn't know. 3 months. Emma's voice gained strength as understanding dawned. 3 months ago was when Grandma Rose died. When I became homeless. When Kane Corp evicted my neighbors. Alexander felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Blackstone knew about you before I did. Knew what about me? Before Alexander could answer, a black sedan pulled up to the park entrance. 3 men in expensive suits got out, moving with the casual coordination of people accustomed to violence. We need to go, Alexander said, standing quickly. Now. Where? Alexander, what's happening? I'll explain everything, but first we need to get somewhere safe. Alexander took Emma's hand, and the electric connection he'd felt in the diner flared between them despite the terror. Do you trust me? Emma looked into his eyes, and Alexander saw her make the choice that would bind them together or destroy them both. Yes. They ran. 20 minutes later, Alexander led Emma into the lobby of the Metropolitan Hotel, the kind of establishment where money bought invisibility and questions were considered poor etiquette. The desk clerk recognized Alexander immediately, but showed no surprise at his disheveled appearance or homeless companion. The penthouse suite, Alexander said quietly. Register it under James Morrison. Of course, Mr. Kane. How long will you be staying? I don't know. In the elevator, Emma finally spoke. James Morrison? My father's name. Before he married my mother and became James Kane. Alexander watched the floor numbers climb. Some aliases are about hiding. Others are about remembering who you used to be. And who did you used to be? Someone who believed money was supposed to help people, not hurt them. The penthouse suite was a monument to tasteful excess, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that cost more than most people's cars, art that belonged in museums. Emma walked to the windows and stared out at the lights below. This is what your world looks like, she said softly. Was. Past tense. Alexander moved to the bar and poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey. As of this afternoon, I'm officially unemployed. Emma turned, surprise replacing wariness. What? The board removed me as CEO. Apparently, refusing to sign foreclosure papers constitutes emotional compromise unfit for corporate leadership. You refused to sign? Emma's voice carried disbelief. But the board meeting. I canceled the Riverside project. All of it. 30,000 families get to keep their homes. Emma stared at him like he'd just claimed to walk on water. You gave up $800 million? I gave up a lot more than that. Alexander drained his whiskey, welcoming the burn. My company, my fortune, my identity. Turns out when you build your entire life on being ruthlessly efficient, people get nervous when you suddenly develop ethics. Alexander. Emma's voice was soft with something he didn't dare hope was forgiveness. You lost everything for those families? I lost everything because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Emma moved closer, studying his face with that artist's intensity that saw through every defense. The threatening note. The men following us. This is because you chose people over profit. This is because my business partner correctly identified you as my weakness and decided to use that against me. Your weakness? Alexander set down his glass and met her eyes. Emma, in one afternoon, you undid 15 years of careful emotional detachment. You made me remember what it felt like to care about someone other than myself. And that terrifies people who profit from my indifference. Emma's expression shifted through a dozen emotions before settling on something that looked like wonder. You really didn't know I was homeless when you met me? I thought you were an art student taking a break in the park. And when you found out the truth? I wanted to fix everything that had ever hurt you. Emma moved closer still, now close enough that Alexander could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Including things you had caused? Especially things I had caused. They stood in the space between honesty and forgiveness, close enough to touch but separated by an ocean of accumulated damage. Alexander could feel the pull between them like gravity, but he didn't move. This choice had to be Emma's. Alexander, Emma said quietly, what happens now? You've lost your company. These people are threatening me. We're hiding in a hotel room like fugitives. What's the plan? I trigger the dissolution clause in my partnership agreement. Blackstone goes down with the company he stole. Then I figure out how to build a life that doesn't require stepping on other people. And me? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure would hold their weight. That depends, Alexander said carefully, on whether you can forgive someone who's spent years being exactly the kind of person you hate. Emma reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the exhaustion lines around his eyes. I don't hate you, Alexander. I hate what you became. But today, I watched you choose to lose everything rather than hurt people you'll never meet. That's not the action of someone who can't be redeemed. Alexander leaned into her touch, feeling something fundamental shift in his chest. Emma, if you stay with me, you'll be in danger. Blackstone won't stop until he's destroyed everything I care about. Maybe. Or maybe he'll discover that some things are stronger than his capacity to destroy them. Before Alexander could respond, Emma stood on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. But when Alexander responded, deepening the connection, it became something else entirely. A promise, a commitment, a declaration of war against everyone who profited from keeping people like them apart. When they broke apart, Emma rested her forehead against his. I'm not going anywhere. Even though I'm broke, unemployed, and apparently have corporate assassins hunting anyone I care about? Emma smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. Especially because of that. The man who had everything was interesting. The man who gave it all up for strangers is extraordinary. Alexander kissed her again, longer this time, feeling years of emotional numbness melt away under her touch. But even as desire built between them, his phone rang with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. The caller ID read Kane Corp Legal. Alexander Kane. His voice was rough with interrupted passion. Mr. Kane, this is Sarah Chin from Legal. I'm calling to inform you that if you proceed with triggering the dissolution clause, Mr. Blackstone has prepared criminal fraud charges against you. Alexander felt the world tilt. What fraud charges? Misappropriation of company funds, specifically the 3-month security detail protecting Ms. Hartwell. He's claiming you used corporate resources for personal relationships. I didn't authorize that security detail. I didn't even know about it. The authorization has your electronic signature and approval codes. Mr. Blackstone has documentation proving you've been using company resources to monitor and protect Ms. Hartwell since her grandmother's death. Alexander's blood turned to ice. That's impossible. I'm sorry, Mr. Kane, but if you trigger dissolution, those charges go to the district attorney tomorrow morning. You're looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The line went dead. Emma had been listening, her face growing paler with each word. They're going to frame you? Worse. Alexander sank into a chair, the magnitude of Blackstone's trap finally becoming clear. They've been planning this for months. The security detail wasn't protecting you. It was creating evidence that I've been obsessed with you since your grandmother died. Every interaction we've had has been documented as proof of my inappropriate fixation with an eviction victim. But that's not true. You just met me today. Can you prove that? Do you have witnesses who can testify about when we first met? Emma's silence was answer enough. Blackstone's turned our entire relationship into evidence of corporate misconduct, Alexander continued. Meeting you, helping you, falling for you. It all looks like the behavior of someone who's been stalking his own victim. Emma sat heavily on the couch. So what are our options? I can trigger dissolution and go to prison, destroying Blackstone but leaving you alone and unprotected. Or I can let him keep the company and hope he loses interest in tormenting us. Those are terrible options. There's a third one. Alexander's voice was quiet. I disappear. Leave the city, maybe the country. Blackstone gets the company, you get left alone, and I spend whatever's left of my life trying to make amends for what I've done. Emma's head snapped up. You're talking about running away? I'm talking about keeping you safe. By abandoning me? Emma's voice gained strength. Alexander, 3 hours ago you gave up $800 million rather than compromise your ethics. Now you want to run away because things got difficult. This isn't difficult, Emma. This is impossible. I can't protect you from this. Maybe you don't have to. Emma stood, moving to the window again. Maybe I can protect myself. How? Emma turned back to him, and Alexander saw something new in her expression. Not hope or fear, but calculation. You said Blackstone's been watching me for 3 months. Documenting everything. Building a case that you've been obsessed with me. Yes. But what if I've been building a case against him? Alexander stared at her. What do you mean? Emma walked to her backpack and pulled out a battered notebook Alexander hadn't noticed before. I told you I draw people in the park. But I don't just draw their faces. I document their behavior, their conversations, their license plates. She opened the notebook, revealing pages of detailed sketches and notes. 3 months ago, I started noticing the same men appearing wherever I went. Same cars. Same routines. So I started documenting them. Alexander took the notebook, flipping through pages of meticulous surveillance documentation. Emma had recorded times, locations, license plate numbers, physical descriptions, even snippets of overheard conversations. Emma, this is professional-level surveillance work. My grandmother didn't just teach me art. She taught me survival. And after my parents died, I learned that the best way to stay safe is to pay attention to everything. Alexander stared at the notebook, understanding dawning. You have evidence that Blackstone's people have been stalking you. I have evidence that multiple corporate employees have been conducting illegal surveillance on a private citizen for months, without her knowledge or consent. But why didn't you tell me about this? Emma's expression grew sad. Because until today, I thought they were your people. I thought maybe wealthy men just did things like that. Had people watched. I didn't know it was wrong until you seemed as surprised as I was. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet again, but this time toward hope instead of despair. Emma, this changes everything. Does it? Before Alexander could answer, the lights in the suite went out. In the darkness, Emma's voice was steady. Alexander, I don't think we're alone anymore. In the darkness, Alexander's training kicked in. Years of corporate survival had taught him to assess threats quickly. The power outage was too convenient, too precisely timed. Someone had cut the electricity to the penthouse. Stay behind me, Alexander whispered, reaching for Emma's hand. I can't see anything, Emma breathed against his ear, her warmth grounding him in the chaos. Emergency lighting should kick in any second. But as Alexander spoke, he realized the silence was wrong. No hum of backup generators, no distant city noise through the soundproof windows. The blackout was too complete, too professional. Then Emma's phone lit up with an incoming call, the screen casting an eerie glow across their faces. The caller ID read unknown, but when Emma answered, putting it on speaker, the voice was terrifyingly familiar. Hello, Emma. Blackstone's voice carried through the darkness like poison honey. I hope you're enjoying your stay at the Metropolitan. Quite an upgrade from sleeping in the park. How are you? Alexander started. Oh, I'm not just watching, Alexander. I'm everywhere. The hotel's security system, the elevators, even the room service. Did you really think you could hide from me in a building I own? Alexander felt the walls closing in. You own the Metropolitan? Through a shell company, yes. Just like I own most of the places you've ever felt safe. Your apartment building, your favorite restaurants, even that little diner where you had your romantic revelation. I've been curating your experiences for quite some time. Emma's grip on Alexander's hand tightened. What do you want? Such a practical question. I want Alexander to understand the cost of emotional compromise. You see, Emma, your new boyfriend has spent 15 years being the perfect business partner, cold, efficient, profitable. But the moment he developed feelings, he became unreliable. Richard, this is between you and me, Alexander said. Leave her out of it. But she's already in it, isn't she? In fact, she's been in it much longer than either of you realize. The emergency lighting finally flickered on, casting the suite in red shadows that made everything look like a crime scene. But they weren't alone. A woman stood silhouetted against the windows, middle-aged, professionally dressed, with Emma's exact bone structure and the same artistic hands. Emma gasped. That's impossible. Hello, sweetheart. The woman's voice was gentle, loving, and completely alive. I've missed you so much. Alexander stared at the woman, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Emma, who is that? My grandmother. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. But she's dead. I watched her die. I held her hand when the hospice administered the final medication, yes. The woman, Rose, stepped into the light, and the resemblance to Emma was unmistakable. Except it wasn't final medication. It was a very expensive cocktail designed to simulate death convincingly enough to fool everyone except the medical examiner I'd bribed. Emma released Alexander's hand and stumbled backward. No, this isn't possible. I buried you. I grieved for you. You buried an empty casket, darling. I'm sorry, but it was necessary. Necessary for what? Alexander demanded, though a terrible understanding was beginning to dawn. Blackstone's voice came from hidden speakers throughout the room. For the most elaborate corporate espionage operation I've ever designed. You see, Alexander, your emotional detachment wasn't a personality flaw. It was your greatest business asset. But I knew that eventually someone would crack that armor. So I decided to control who that someone would be. The room seemed to spin around Alexander. You're saying Emma is the granddaughter of Rose Hartwell, former head of corporate intelligence for Kane Corporation. She worked for your father, Alexander. Built the surveillance systems you've been using for decades. Emma was shaking her head frantically. That's not true. Grandma Rose was a seamstress. She never. I was many things, sweetheart. Rose moved closer, her expression infinitely sad. Seamstress was just my cover. I spent 20 years gathering intelligence for Kane Corp., helping them identify which properties to acquire, which communities were vulnerable to development pressure. You're lying. Emma's voice cracked. The cancer was real, Emma. But when I realized I was dying, I also realized I'd spent my life helping corporations destroy communities like the one that raised me. I wanted to make amends. Alexander felt reality reconstructing itself around him with sickening clarity. So you faked your death, and convinced your granddaughter that Kane Corp evictions had made her homeless, Blackstone continued through the speakers, creating the perfect weapon to compromise Alexander's judgment. A beautiful, talented, genuinely innocent girl who had every reason to hate him, but enough hope to love him anyway. Emma was staring at her grandmother in horror. You used me. I saved you, Rose said desperately. When I died, when I was supposed to die, you would have had nothing. No family, no money, no prospects. This way, you could have everything. Alexander's fortune, his connections, his protection. But I didn't want his fortune. Emma screamed. I wanted my grandmother. I wanted my life. I wanted. Her voice broke completely. Alexander watched the woman he'd fallen in love with crumble under the weight of ultimate betrayal, and felt his own heart shatter in sympathy. Emma, whatever this is, whatever they've done, it doesn't change. Doesn't it? Emma turned to him with tears streaming down her face. Don't you see? Every moment between us has been orchestrated. My homelessness, my desperation, my hope. All of it designed to make you fall for me. That's not true, Alexander said desperately. What I feel for you is exactly what they wanted you to feel. Emma's voice gained hysterical strength. They studied you, Alexander. They knew exactly what kind of woman would crack your emotional armor. Someone vulnerable but strong, artistic but practical, someone who'd lost everything but still believed in goodness. Alexander stared at Emma, understanding crashing over him like ice water. You're saying I didn't fall in love with you. I fell in love with a construction designed to manipulate me. The irony is delicious, Blackstone's voice purred through the speakers. The king of emotional manipulation, manipulated by the most basic emotion of all. Rose stepped forward, reaching for Emma's hands. Sweetheart, you have to understand. I never meant for you to actually care about him. You were supposed to get close, gather information, help us control his business decisions. I never anticipated that I'd actually fall in love with him. Emma jerked away from her grandmother's touch. That I'd actually believe he was changing? That I'd actually think we could build something real? Emma, Alexander said quietly, what we have is real. Is it? Emma turned to him with devastation in her eyes. How can you be sure? How can either of us be sure of anything when everything about how we met was a lie? Alexander opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. Because Emma was right. Every emotion he'd felt, every moment of connection, every belief that he was becoming a better person. All of it had been engineered by people who understood exactly how to weaponize hope against despair. Even if it started as manipulation, Alexander said desperately, what happened between us today was real. Your anger when you discovered who I was, your willingness to forgive me, the way you kissed me. Was it real? Emma's voice was hollow. Or was it the reaction they programmed into me? How do I know the difference between genuine emotion and sophisticated conditioning? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Blackstone's laughter echoed through the room. And there it is. The beauty of psychological manipulation. Once you know it's happening, you can never trust your own feelings again. Rose looked between Alexander and Emma with growing horror. I never meant for this to happen. Emma, darling, you have to believe. I don't have to believe anything. Emma screamed. Because apparently nothing I've believed about my life has been true. My grandmother is alive. My homelessness was orchestrated. My feelings for Alexander might be programmed responses. What's real? What's actually real? Alexander moved toward her, but Emma backed away. Don't. Emma's voice was breaking. Please don't. Because if you touch me right now, if you try to comfort me, I won't know if I want your comfort because I love you or because they designed me to want it. Emma, I need to go. Emma was backing toward the door. I need to get away from all of you and figure out who I actually am when I'm not being manipulated by people who claim to love me. You can't leave, Rose said desperately. It's not safe. Blackstone's people are no more dangerous than the people in this room. Emma's eyes swept between her grandmother and Alexander. At least with strangers, I know they're trying to hurt me. With you too, I don't know what's real and what's performance. Alexander watched Emma walk toward the door and felt his world ending. Emma, please. Whatever this is, we can figure it out together. Emma paused at the door, not turning around. Can we? Because right now, I don't know if together is something I chose or something I was programmed to want. I love you, Alexander said desperately. Do you? Or do you love the idea of redemption through saving someone who's been perfectly crafted to need saving? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow because he couldn't answer it with complete certainty. And that, Emma said quietly, is how I know I have to leave. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving Alexander standing in the wreckage of what might have been the most genuine connection of his life or the most sophisticated manipulation he'd ever fallen for. Rose moved to follow, but Alexander caught her arm. Let her go. She's my granddaughter. She's a human being who's just discovered that the two people she trusted most have been lying to her for months. Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. She needs space to figure out who she is when she's not being manipulated by people who claim to love her. Through the speakers, Blackstone's voice carried smug satisfaction. Excellent work, everyone. Alexander's judgment is now so compromised he can't trust his own emotions. Emma's too psychologically devastated to be useful to anyone, and Rose's cover is blown forever. Clean victory all around. Alexander stared at Rose, understanding flooding through him. This isn't what you wanted. No. Rose's voice was broken. I thought if I could get you two together, maybe you'd help each other heal. Maybe Emma could find stability and you could find humanity. Instead, I've destroyed the only person I ever loved more than my own life. And I've lost the only woman who ever made me want to be better than I am, Alexander added quietly. They stood in the red emergency lighting, two people who'd destroyed what they'd tried to save through their own attempts at control. What happens now? Rose asked. Alexander walked to the window and stared out at the city lights, each one representing someone whose life he'd affected through years of corporate decisions. Now I figure out how to become the man Emma saw in me, even if she's not there to see it. And you figure out how to earn forgiveness from a granddaughter who has every right to never speak to you again. And Blackstone? Alexander smiled grimly. Richard made one crucial mistake. He assumed that destroying my emotional connections would make me weak. But Emma taught me something he'll never understand. What's that? The most dangerous person in the world isn't someone with nothing left to lose. It's someone who's learned to love something more than themselves, and then watched it be destroyed by people who think caring is weakness. Alexander turned from the window, and Rose stepped back from the cold fury in his eyes. Richard's about to discover that a man with a dead heart is predictably ruthless. But a man with a broken heart. Alexander's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. That's someone who'll burn down everything, including himself, to protect what matters. As if summoned by his words, Emma's scream echoed through the hotel corridor. Alexander and Rose ran for the door, understanding with crystal clarity that Blackstone's psychological game was far from over. Alexander burst into the hallway to find Emma pressed against the wall, 3 men in black surrounding her with the casual menace of predators who'd cornered their prey. But these weren't Blackstone's usual corporate enforcers. These men carried themselves with military precision and the kind of calm that came from professional violence. "Step away from her," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying an authority that had once moved billions of dollars with a phone call. The lead man turned, revealing a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by wealthy threats. "Mr. Kane, you're coming with us." "Like hell I am." "Actually," the man continued with patient menace, "you are. Because if you don't, Ms. Hartwell pays the price for your defiance." Alexander felt the trap closing around them with mathematical precision. "What do you want?" "Mr. Blackstone wants to have a conversation. About the future of Kane Corp and your emotional entanglements." Emma pushed away from the wall, her face pale but determined. "Don't go, Alexander. Whatever Blackstone wants, it's not worth." "Ms. Hartwell." The lead man's voice cut through her words like a blade. "You might want to consider that your safety depends entirely on Mr. Kane's cooperation." Alexander saw the calculation in Emma's eyes, the same survivor's instinct that had kept her alive on the streets. She was weighing odds, assessing threats, preparing for whatever came next. But there was something else in her expression, a complete absence of trust in anyone, including him. "Emma," Alexander said quietly, "whatever happens, remember that what I feel for you is real, even if everything else was orchestrated." Emma's laugh was hollow, devastating. "How can you be sure? How can either of us ever be sure of anything again?" Before Alexander could answer, Rose appeared in the doorway behind them. "Take me instead," she said to the men. "I'm the one who created this mess. Leave Emma and Alexander out of it." The lead man smiled, and the expression was colder than winter. "Oh, Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Blackstone specifically requested your presence as well. It seems you've all played your parts so beautifully, he wants the entire cast for the final act." "This is insane," Emma said, her voice gaining strength. "You can't just kidnap people in the middle of Manhattan." "Ms. Hartwell, we own this building, the security company that monitors it, the police precinct that would respond to calls from this address, and the hospital that would treat any unfortunate accidents. We're not kidnapping anyone. We're simply extending an invitation that would be unhealthy to refuse." Alexander felt the weight of Blackstone's preparation, the months, perhaps years, of positioning pieces on a board he'd never even realized existed. "Where are you taking us?" "Somewhere you'll have an opportunity to make very important choices about very important things." The men flanked them as they moved toward the service elevator, their formation professional, but not quite tight enough to prevent escape. Alexander caught Emma's eye and saw her thinking the same thing. There would be opportunities to run, but only if they were willing to sacrifice each other. "Don't even think about it," the lead man said, reading their silent communication. "Ms. Hartwell, if Mr. Kane attempts anything heroic, you'll discover that bullet wounds are considerably more painful than homelessness. Mr. Kane, if Ms. Hartwell tries to run, you'll watch her disappear permanently into a system that eats idealistic young women for breakfast." The elevator descended past the parking garage into sub-basements Alexander hadn't known existed. When the doors opened, they revealed a tunnel system that stretched into darkness, The kind of urban infrastructure that officially didn't exist, but had been moving powerful people unseen for decades. "Welcome to the real city," the lead man said. "The one that operates below the one you pretend to understand." They walked through tunnels lined with pipes and cables, the sound of their footsteps echoing off concrete walls that had never seen daylight. Emma stayed close to Alexander despite her emotional devastation, survival instinct overriding personal betrayal. "Are you okay?" Alexander asked quietly. "Define okay," Emma replied. "My grandmother faked her death. My entire life story was apparently fiction. The man I'm falling for might be a psychological construction, and now we're being kidnapped through secret tunnels by corporate mercenaries. So, just another Tuesday." Alexander almost smiled at her dark humor before remembering that even her capacity for resilience might have been engineered for his emotional manipulation. "Emma," Rose said from behind them, "I know you hate me right now." "Hate?" Emma turned, walking backward while facing her grandmother. "Grandma, I grieved for you. I held your dying hand and promised to live the life you taught me to value. I've spent 3 months believing that my art and my hope were the only things left of the woman who raised me. Hate doesn't begin to cover what I'm feeling. I did it to protect you. You did it to control me." Emma's voice echoed off the tunnel walls. "Just like everyone else in my life, apparently. You saw someone who needed direction and decided you knew better than I did about what I wanted." Alexander watched Emma's anger burn through her devastation and felt something shift in his chest. This is real. Whatever else had been orchestrated, this fury was purely Emma's, raw, authentic, unmanipulated by anyone's agenda. "You want to know the really tragic part?" Emma continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I actually was falling in love with Alexander. Not because you programmed me to, not because he was rich enough to save me, but because for the first time in my life, I met someone whose emotional pain matched mine. Someone who'd lost his parents too young and learned to protect himself by not feeling anything." She turned to Alexander, tears streaming down her face. "I loved that you were broken, because it meant you understood why I kept everyone at arm's length. I loved that you were trying to change, because it gave me hope that I could change too. And now I'll never know if any of that was real or just sophisticated behavioral conditioning." Alexander felt his heart breaking and reforming simultaneously. "Emma, don't." Emma held up her hand. "Whatever you're about to say, I need you to understand something. Even if our feelings are real, even if this whole situation is exactly what it appears to be, I can't be with someone who makes me question my own emotional authenticity. I'd rather be alone and honest than together and uncertain." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. "So that's it? We just give up. We accept reality." Emma's voice was quiet but final. "Some damage can't be undone. Some trust can't be repaired. Some love stories don't get happy endings because the people who wrote them weren't writing love stories at all." They emerged from the tunnels into a warehouse district that felt like entering another world entirely. Industrial buildings stretched in all directions, their windows dark except for scattered security lights that created pools of yellow in the surrounding darkness. "Almost there," the lead man announced, gesturing toward a building that looked abandoned from the outside but hummed with the subtle energy of active occupation. As they approached the entrance, Alexander realized this was his last chance to make a choice that might actually protect Emma. "Wait," he said to their escorts. "I'll make you a deal." "Alexander, don't," Emma said immediately. "Let Emma and Rose go," Alexander continued. "I'll give Blackstone whatever he wants, my cooperation, my silence, my complete surrender to whatever scheme he's running. But they walk away free." The lead man considered this. "And what makes you think you have anything Mr. Blackstone wants badly enough to trade for their freedom? Because destroying me was never the goal. Breaking me was. And you can't break someone who has nothing left to lose. But someone who's trying to protect the people he loves." Alexander looked at Emma. "That person can be controlled forever." Emma stared at him in horror. "You're talking about sacrificing yourself. I'm talking about making sure you're safe. By becoming Blackstone's puppet? By spending the rest of your life as his corporate slave. If that's what it takes." Emma moved closer, her eyes blazing with fury. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this mess. You and my grandmother, both deciding you know what's best for me, both willing to sacrifice everything to protect me from choices I never asked you to make." "Emma, no. You want to know what would actually protect me? You becoming the man you were trying to be this afternoon. You fighting for what's right instead of what's safe. You refusing to let people like Blackstone turn love into a weapon. Alexander stared at Emma, seeing something in her expression that took his breath away. Despite everything, the manipulation, the betrayal, the uncertainty about their own emotions, she was fighting for them. For the possibility of what they could be together. You still believe we're worth fighting for? Alexander asked quietly. I believe the people we're trying to become are worth fighting for, Emma corrected. Whether that includes being together, we'll figure out after we survive whatever's waiting in that building. The lead man cleared his throat impatiently. Touching as this is, Mr. Blackstone is waiting. They entered the building through a service entrance that led into what had once been a manufacturing floor. But instead of industrial equipment, the space had been converted into something that looked like a cross between a corporate boardroom and an interrogation facility. Blackstone stood at the center of it all, perfectly dressed despite the late hour, surveying his dominion with the satisfaction of a chess master approaching checkmate. Alexander, Emma rose, he said warmly, as if greeting old friends. Welcome to the heart of Kane Corp's real operations. The place where we make the decisions that actually matter. Alexander looked around the space and felt his blood freeze. The walls were covered with surveillance photos, financial documents, and what looked like psychological profiles. But not just of him and Emma, of hundreds of people. Politicians, activists, business rivals, anyone who'd ever opposed Kane Corp's expansion. You've been running this for years, Alexander said, understanding dawning. Decades, Blackstone corrected. Your father started it, actually, though he lacked the vision to realize its full potential. Emma was staring at a wall covered with photos of herself, not just from the past 3 months, but going back years. Pictures of her with her grandmother, at art school, even as a child. How long have you been watching me? She whispered. Since you were 8 years old, Blackstone said matter-of-factly. Right after your parents died. Rose was already working for us then, and we needed to ensure her loyalty. Nothing guarantees cooperation, quite like having leverage over someone's family. Rose moved protectively toward Emma. You said you'd leave her alone if I helped with the intelligence work. I said I wouldn't harm her. I never said I wouldn't monitor her. Insurance, you understand. Alexander felt rage building in his chest like pressure in a boiler. You've been manipulating Emma's entire life. I've been managing valuable assets. Emma's artistic talent, her emotional resilience, her capacity for hope despite adversity, all very useful qualities in the right circumstances. She's not an asset, Alexander said, his voice dangerous. She's a human being. She's both. Just like you. Just like everyone who's ever been useful to me. Blackstone moved to a control panel and pressed several buttons. Screens descended from the ceiling, displaying what looked like a live feed of the Kane Corp building. As we speak, Blackstone said, my people are executing the final phase of the Riverside project. 30,000 families are being evicted tonight, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The shock and speed will prevent organized resistance. Alexander stared at the screens, watching families being forced from their homes in the middle of the night. You can't do this. The project was canceled. By a CEO who's no longer in charge. I'm afraid your dramatic gesture this afternoon was purely symbolic. Emma was watching the screens with growing horror. Those children, it's December. Where are they supposed to go? Not my concern, Blackstone said. Though I'm sure there are shelters that can accommodate some of them. You're destroying these families to prove a point, Alexander said. I'm executing a profitable business plan while demonstrating the consequences of emotional decision-making. If you'd simply signed the papers this afternoon, this could have been handled more humanely. Your conscience has made everything more brutal. Alexander felt the weight of impossible moral mathematics. His attempt to save these families had instead made their suffering worse. But here's the beautiful part, Blackstone continued. You can still stop it. He gestured to a table where 3 documents waited with pens beside them. Contract number 1. Alexander signs over all remaining Kane Corp holdings to me, agrees to never compete in the development business, and submits to regular psychological monitoring to ensure compliance. In exchange, the Riverside evictions stop immediately and all affected families receive substantial relocation assistance. Alexander stared at the contract that would make him Blackstone's prisoner for life. Contract number 2. Emma agrees to marry Alexander in a ceremony I'll arrange, with a prenuptial agreement that gives me control over all shared assets. She becomes my insurance that Alexander remains cooperative. In exchange, her grandmother receives full medical care and a comfortable retirement. Emma's face went white. You're asking me to become a hostage to my own feelings. Contract number 3. Rose agrees to resume her intelligence work, expanding operations to include other cities, other companies. In exchange, Emma and Alexander are allowed to build whatever life they choose, completely free from my influence. Alexander looked at the 3 contracts, understanding the cruel genius of Blackstone's design. Each person could save the others, but only by sacrificing themselves. You've created a situation where love becomes destruction, Alexander said quietly. I've created a situation where you all finally understand what I've known for years. Emotion is always a weakness that can be exploited. The only question is whether you'll learn from this experience or continue to make the same mistakes. Emma was staring at the screens, watching families huddle in the cold outside their former homes. How long do we have to decide? Until sunrise. About 4 hours. After that, the evictions become permanent and the contracts expire. Alexander looked at Emma and Rose, seeing his own devastation reflected in their faces. They'd been outmaneuvered completely, their love for each other transformed into the perfect weapon against them. There has to be another way, Emma said desperately. There's always another way, Blackstone agreed. You could choose to do nothing. Let the families be destroyed, maintain your principles, and live with the knowledge that 30,000 people are homeless because you were too proud to sacrifice your personal happiness for their welfare. The silence that followed was the sound of 3 people realizing they'd been backed into a corner, where every option led to different forms of destruction. Choose wisely, Blackstone said. And remember, in 4 hours, the sun rises on whatever world you've decided to create. For hours until sunrise. Alexander stared at the 3 contracts spread across the table like tarot cards promising different forms of damnation. Around them, the screens continued broadcasting the riverside evictions. Families stumbling into the December night with whatever possessions they could carry, children crying, elderly residents collapsing from shock and cold. Stop looking at them, Emma said quietly. She'd moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth, but far enough to maintain the emotional distance her shattered trust demanded. How can I not look? Every minute I delay signing, more families lose their homes. And every minute you spend torturing yourself with guilt makes it harder to think clearly. Alexander turned to study Emma's face. Despite everything, the manipulation, the betrayal, the impossible situation, she was still trying to help him find clarity. Why do you care? If you can't trust your feelings for me, why does it matter what I choose? Emma was quiet for a long moment, her artist's eyes taking in details that others missed. The exhaustion lines around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly, the careful control that barely contained his desperation. Because, she said finally, even if I can't trust my feelings, I can still recognize authentic choice when I see it. And right now, you're about to make a decision based on guilt and desperation instead of who you actually want to become. Who I want to become? Alexander's laugh was bitter. Emma, in 4 hours, I'll either be Blackstone's slave, you'll be trapped in a loveless marriage, or your grandmother will be back to destroying communities for profit. Who I want to become is irrelevant. Is it? Emma moved to the wall covered with surveillance photos and pulled down a picture of herself from 3 months ago, the day her grandmother died. In the photo, she was leaving the hospital, her face streaked with tears but her shoulders straight with determination. This was taken the worst day of my life, Emma said. I'd just lost the only family I had left. I was about to lose my apartment. My entire future had crumbled. But look at my face. Alexander looked. Even in grief, even in devastation, the Emma in the photo carried herself with dignity. I didn't know I was being photographed. This wasn't performance or manipulation. This was me, authentically me, choosing to keep walking forward even when everything was falling apart. Emma turned to face him. That's how I know that whatever I felt for you today was real. Because the same determination that got me through losing my grandmother is what made me believe you could change. And Blackstone's manipulation doesn't create that kind of recognition. It exploits it. Alexander felt something shift in his chest. You're saying our connection was real even if the circumstances were orchestrated. I'm saying that authentic people recognize each other, even in inauthentic situations. Emma's voice gained strength. And I'm saying that the Alexander who refused to sign foreclosure papers today, that person exists independent of any manipulation. That person is who you really are when you stop being afraid of feeling something. From across the room, Rose had been listening to their conversation with growing understanding. Emma's right, she said quietly. I manipulated the circumstances that brought you together, but I couldn't manufacture your actual responses to each other. You manipulated everything, Emma said, not turning around. I manipulated the setup. But your capacity for hope, your artistic vision, your ability to see goodness in broken people, those weren't created by me. They were already part of who you are. Rose moved closer, her voice carrying decades of regret. And Alexander, your willingness to sacrifice profit for principle, your desire to protect Emma even when it cost you everything, that came from you, not from my scheming. Alexander looked between Emma and Rose, feeling the ground shifting beneath his feet again. So what are you saying? That despite all the manipulation, we somehow found something real. I'm saying, Emma replied, that maybe the question isn't whether our feelings are authentic. Maybe the question is whether we're brave enough to choose each other despite uncertainty. Blackstone's voice cut through their conversation from hidden speakers. 1 hour until sunrise. I hope you're using your time wisely. Alexander walked to the surveillance screens, studying the faces of displaced families. But this time, instead of guilt, he felt something else building in his chest, anger. Clean, focused, purposeful anger. He's been playing us like chess pieces, Alexander said quietly. Every move we've made, he's anticipated. Every emotion we've felt, he's tried to control. Yes, Emma agreed. So what do we do about it? Alexander turned to face Emma and Rose, and they saw something new in his expression. Not the desperate guilt that had driven his earlier decisions, but the cold calculation that had once made him one of the most successful businessmen in the city. We stopped playing his game. What do you mean? Rose asked. Blackstone's entire strategy depends on us accepting that we have only 3 choices. But what if there's a 4th option he hasn't considered? Emma's eyes lit up with understanding. You want to find a way to save everyone. I want to find a way to destroy him. Alexander moved to the contracts, studying them with the analytical precision that had once made him millions. These contracts are designed to create an impossible moral choice. But what if the choice itself is the trap? Explain, Emma said. Blackstone wants us to choose between personal happiness and collective welfare. But that's a false dilemma. The real choice is between accepting his power or dismantling it entirely. Rose moved closer. Alexander, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that Blackstone made one critical error. He assumed that love would make us weak, would force us to sacrifice principles for personal protection. But what if love makes us stronger? What if it gives us something worth fighting for instead of something to be afraid of losing? Alexander picked up the first contract, the one that would make him Blackstone's slave for life. This contract has a dissolution clause. If Kane Corp ceases to exist as a corporate entity, all obligations become void. You can't dissolve Kane Corp, Rose said. You don't have the authority anymore. No, but I have something better. Alexander smiled grimly. I have 15 years of detailed knowledge about every illegal operation Blackstone has ever run, including this psychological torture facility we're standing in. Emma stared at him. You're talking about going to war with someone who owns half the city. I'm talking about exposing someone who's spent decades treating human beings like chess pieces. Alexander moved to the control panel Blackstone had used earlier, his fingers flying across interfaces he'd helped design years ago. Emma, remember when you said you'd been documenting the surveillance for 3 months? Yes. And Rose, you said you helped build Kane Corp's intelligence systems? That's right. Then between the 3 of us, we have everything we need to bring him down. Emma's documentation proves illegal surveillance, Rose's knowledge reveals the scope of the operations, and I know where all the financial bodies are buried. Emma was beginning to smile, the first genuine smile Alexander had seen from her since the truth was revealed. You're not choosing between the contracts. You're choosing to make all of them irrelevant. Exactly. But before Alexander could continue, slow applause echoed through the warehouse. Blackstone emerged from the shadows, no longer bothering to hide behind screens and speakers. Brilliant, he said. Absolutely brilliant. I was wondering when you'd figure out that the contracts were designed to be rejected. Alexander felt ice water flood his veins. What? Did you really think I'd spend decades building this operation only to risk it all on contracts that could be voided through dissolution? Blackstone's smile was sharp as a blade. The contracts were never the real trap, Alexander. They were designed to push you toward exactly this moment. What moment? The moment when you'd try to destroy Kane Corp to save your conscience. The moment when you'd choose idealistic destruction over pragmatic compromise. Emma was backing away from Blackstone, her survival instincts screaming danger. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Kane Corp's dissolution would trigger the financial collapse of 17 subsidiary companies, the bankruptcy of 4 major pension funds, and the unemployment of 37,000 people across 12 cities. Alexander stared at Blackstone in horror. That's impossible. Is it? You've been away from operational details for months, focused on your little emotional journey. Did you really think I wasn't preparing for this contingency? Rose moved protectively toward Emma. You're bluffing. Am I? Blackstone gestured to the screens, which now displayed financial documents showing Kane Corp's integration into dozens of seemingly unrelated businesses. Alexander triggers dissolution, and within 72 hours, more people lose their livelihoods than you could save in a decade of charitable work. Alexander felt the trap closing around him with perfect mathematical precision. So the choice isn't between the contracts and dissolution. It's between local suffering and systemic collapse. Now you're beginning to understand the real game. Emma was staring at the financial documents, her face pale. He's been planning this for years. Every business decision, every acquisition, it was all designed to make Kane Corp too big to fail. Too big to dissolve, Blackstone corrected. Which means, Alexander, that your only real choices are the ones I originally offered. Personal slavery, Emma's imprisonment, or Rose's return to service. The warehouse fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of families being evicted from their homes. Alexander looked at Emma and Rose, seeing his own devastation reflected in their faces. Blackstone had played them perfectly, giving them hope, letting them believe they'd found a solution, then revealing that even their rebellion was part of his design. Unless, Emma said quietly. Unless what? Alexander asked. Emma walked to her backpack and pulled out the notebook she'd shown him earlier, her surveillance documentation of Blackstone's people. But this time, she opened it to pages Alexander hadn't seen before. Unless we use the one thing Blackstone never anticipated. Which is? Emma smiled, and the expression carried something that made Alexander's heart stop. Not hope, not desperation, but absolute certainty. The fact that he's been so busy manipulating us, he forgot to consider what we might do to him. Emma held up a page from her notebook that showed detailed sketches and notes about the warehouse they were standing in, architectural details, security layouts, employee schedules. Emma, Rose breathed. When did you? 3 months ago, the same men who were watching me also led me here. They thought I was unconscious in their van, but I was documenting everything. Emma's voice gained strength. I've been planning for this moment since the day my grandmother supposedly died. Alexander stared at Emma, understanding flooding through him. You've been playing the long game. I've been surviving. And sometimes survival requires letting people think they're hunting you while you're actually hunting them. Blackstone's confidence flickered for the first time. What exactly do you think you can accomplish? Emma walked to the control panel Alexander had been working on, but instead of the corporate interface, she accessed something else entirely, a direct connection to every major news outlet in the city. I can broadcast everything, Emma said simply. Every illegal surveillance operation, every psychological manipulation, every family being evicted tonight. I can show the world exactly who Richard Blackstone really is. And destroy 37,000 jobs in the process, Blackstone said, but his voice carried less certainty now. Or, Alexander said, understanding Emma's plan with crystalline clarity, create 37,000 opportunities for people to work for companies that don't treat human beings like game pieces. Rose was staring at her granddaughter with something approaching awe. Emma, the legal consequences will be mine to face, Emma said firmly. But at least there'll be consequences I chose instead of consequences that were chosen for me. Alexander moved to stand beside Emma at the control panel. What do you need me to do? Emma looked at him, and for the first time since learning the truth about their orchestrated meeting, her expression held no uncertainty. I need you to be the man you were trying to become today. The one who chooses people over profit, even when it costs everything. And if we're wrong, if bringing down Blackstone really does destroy more lives than it saves, then we'll spend the rest of our lives working to rebuild what we broke. Together. Alexander stared at Emma, this woman who'd been manipulated, betrayed, and used by everyone who claimed to love her, yet still chose to fight for strangers she'd never meet. Together, he asked quietly. If you want to be, Emma replied. Not because our feelings were programmed or because circumstances forced us toward each other, but because we're choosing each other despite every reason to walk away. Alexander looked at Emma, at Rose, at the screens showing families in the street, at Blackstone's furious face, and felt something settle in his chest like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. This was the moment. Not a choice between predetermined options, but the choice to write their own ending. "Then let's bring him down," Alexander said. And together, they reached for the broadcast controls. Emma's fingers moved across the broadcast controls with the precision of someone who'd spent months planning this exact moment. Alexander watched her work, marveling at the transformation from the fragile girl he'd met in the park to the focused woman orchestrating the downfall of one of the most powerful men in the city. "Broadcasting in 30 seconds, Emma announced. "Alexander, I need you to upload every financial document you can access. Rose, can you get into the psychological profiles?" "Already on it," Rose said, her intelligence training overriding years of regret as she navigated Kane Corp's surveillance systems. Blackstone stood frozen, his perfect composure finally cracking. "You have no idea what you're destroying." "We're destroying a system that treats people like objects," Alexander replied, his fingers flying across interfaces he'd designed to be impenetrable to outsiders, but had never bothered to protect from insiders. "Maybe it's time someone did." 10 seconds, Emma called out. Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Director Walsh at Kane Corp Security. He answered, putting it on speaker. "Mr. Kane, we're showing massive system intrusions across all Kane Corp networks." "Are you?" "Director Walsh," Alexander interrupted. "This is Alexander Kane authorizing emergency disclosure of all Kane Corp surveillance operations under whistleblower protection statutes. Record this call as official notification." "Sir, I don't understand." "You will in about 5 seconds." Emma pressed the final button, and every screen in the warehouse blazed to life with a live broadcast that was simultaneously hitting every major news outlet in the city. But instead of Emma or Alexander appearing on screen, the broadcast opened with something none of them had expected. A video message from someone Alexander had thought was dead. "If you're seeing this recording," the voice said, "then my son Alexander has finally found the courage I never had." Alexander's blood turned to ice. On the screen, looking exactly as he remembered from 20 years ago, was his father. "James Kane," Emma whispered. "Dad." Alexander stared at the screen in shock. "That's impossible. He died in the car crash with my mother." But Rose's face had gone white. "Alexander, I need to tell you something about your parents' death." On the screen, James Kane continued speaking. "I'm recording this message in 2019, 5 years after Richard Blackstone murdered your mother and attempted to murder me. I've been in hiding ever since, gathering evidence of his crimes, waiting for the right moment to expose him." The warehouse fell into stunned silence. "My death was staged," James Kane's voice continued, "with the help of Rose Hartwell, my most trusted intelligence operative. We knew that as long as Blackstone believed I was dead, he'd focus on controlling you instead of trying to kill me." Alexander turned to Rose with fury and devastation warring in his expression. "You knew my father was alive?" "I helped him fake his death to save his life," Rose said desperately. "Richard had already killed your mother when she discovered his illegal operations. Your father was next." On screen, James Kane was explaining with devastating clarity how Blackstone had systematically taken over Kane Corp through murder, manipulation, and psychological control. "The surveillance network you're seeing," James Kane said, "was originally designed to protect communities from predatory development. Richard perverted it into a weapon to destroy them." Emma was staring at the screen with growing understanding. "The security detail that protected me for 3 months, that wasn't Blackstone's people. That was your father's. And the men who threatened you today," Rose added, "those were Blackstone's operatives, trying to force us into this exact situation." Alexander felt reality reconstructing itself around him yet again. "So everything we thought we knew was another layer of Blackstone's manipulation," Emma finished. "He wanted us to discover the truth about my grandmother, wanted us to feel betrayed and uncertain, wanted us desperate enough to make exactly the choice we just made." Blackstone began laughing, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. "Brilliant deduction. But you're still missing the most important piece." On the screen, James Kane's recording had reached its crucial revelation. "The broadcast system you're using to expose Richard was designed by him. Every transmission is being recorded, every participant identified, every piece of evidence you think you're releasing is actually being filtered through systems he controls." Alexander's heart stopped. We're not exposing him. We're giving him everything he needs to destroy us. And more importantly, Blackstone said, his composure fully restored, you're giving me legal justification to activate Kane Corp's emergency protocols. The screens around them shifted to show a new image. Military vehicles surrounding the warehouse, federal agents moving into position, helicopters circling overhead. Emergency protocols? Emma asked. Kane Corp holds contracts with Homeland Security for domestic terrorism prevention, Blackstone explained casually. The moment you began broadcasting classified intelligence operations, you became enemy combatants. Everything that happens to you now is legally sanctioned. Rose was backing toward Emma, her protective instincts overriding her shock. Richard, you can't. I can do anything I want, Rose. I've spent 20 years building a system where my enemies destroy themselves trying to fight me. Alexander stared at the screens, watching armed agents take positions around their only exits. So this was all. A trap within a trap within a trap, Blackstone confirmed. James Kane's recording was planted to make you feel betrayed. Rose's revelations were designed to make you question everything. Emma's surveillance documentation was fed to her by my people. Every choice you've made tonight has led you deeper into my control. Emma was staring at her notebook, the surveillance records she'd thought were her secret weapon. You gave me the evidence. I gave you exactly what you needed to feel empowered while actually being helpless. But as Blackstone spoke, Alexander noticed something the older man had missed. On one of the screens still showing the Kane Corp building, families weren't being evicted. They were being helped back into their apartments by what looked like federal housing officials. Emma, Alexander said quietly, look at screen 7. Emma followed his gaze and saw what he'd seen. The eviction stopped. More than stopped, Rose added, studying the images. Those are federal agents providing emergency housing assistance. Blackstone turned to look at the screens, and for the first time all night, his expression showed genuine confusion. That's impossible. The federal contracts don't authorize. They do if Kane Corp is under federal investigation for domestic terrorism, a new voice said from the warehouse entrance. Everyone turned to see a woman in a federal agent's jacket walking toward them, flanked by agents who were definitely not under Blackstone's control. Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI, the woman announced. Mr. Blackstone, you're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and about 47 other charges we'll discuss downtown. Blackstone's face went white. You can't be here. The protocols were designed by your father, Alexander, Agent Martinez said, moving closer. James Kane spent 5 years building a federal case against Richard Blackstone. Tonight's broadcast wasn't meant to expose Richard to the public. It was meant to provide legal justification for federal intervention. Alexander stared at the agent. My father's alive? Very much so, and very eager to see you. Emma was looking between the screens, her artist's eye catching details others missed. The families being helped back into their apartments. Those aren't Riverside tenants. Those are people who were evicted months ago. Federal restitution program, Agent Martinez confirmed. We've been quietly reversing every Kane Corp eviction from the past 2 years while building the case against Blackstone. Rose was staring at Agent Martinez with growing recognition. Sarah? Sarah Chun from Kane Corp Legal? Agent Martinez smiled. 5-year undercover assignment. Though I have to say, watching Richard think he was manipulating federal contracts while actually working for federal agents was almost entertaining. Blackstone was backing away from the approaching agents, his perfect composure finally shattered completely. This is impossible. I control everything. I've planned for every contingency. You planned for everything except the possibility that the people you were manipulating might actually care about each other more than they cared about your opinion of them, Emma said. Alexander turned to Emma, understanding flooding through him. You knew. I suspected. The surveillance documentation was too convenient, the threats too perfectly timed. But I couldn't be sure until tonight. So you took the risk anyway. Emma moved closer to Alexander, taking his hand for the first time since learning about the manipulation. I took the risk because I realized something tonight. Whether our feelings are authentic or programmed doesn't matter as much as whether we choose to act authentically going forward. Alexander felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. Emma, I don't deserve. None of us deserve anything, Emma interrupted. But we can choose to earn what we want to build together. As federal agents placed handcuffs on Blackstone, he turned back to Alexander and Emma one final time. You think you've won? You've destroyed a major corporation, thrown thousands of people out of work. And for what? A love story that started as a lie. Alexander looked at Emma, seeing in her eyes the same thing he felt in his own heart. Not certainty about their feelings, but certainty about their choice to keep feeling despite uncertainty. For the chance to find out who we really are when we're not being manipulated by people who think caring is weakness, Alexander replied. Agent Martinez approached them as the last of Blackstone's operatives were led away in handcuffs. Your father's waiting outside. Are you ready to see him? Alexander turned to Emma and Rose. Are we ready? Emma squeezed his hand. I don't know, but I think that's okay. Maybe the point isn't being ready. Maybe the point is choosing to walk forward together anyway. Rose was crying, tears of relief, regret, and hope in equal measure. Emma, can you forgive me for trying to protect me in the most misguided way possible? Emma's smile was sad but genuine. Grandma, I can forgive you for lying to me. Can you forgive me for being strong enough that I didn't need to be lied to? As they walked toward the warehouse exit, Alexander realized that the impossible choice hadn't been between the contracts or dissolution or exposure. The impossible choice had been between cynicism and hope, between protecting themselves and protecting each other, between accepting manipulation and choosing authentic connection despite its risks. They'd chosen hope. They'd chosen each other. They'd chosen to believe that love, uncertain, complicated, potentially programmed love, was still worth fighting for. Outside, dawn was breaking over a city where 30,000 families were waking up in their own homes, where a corrupt corporate empire was crumbling, and where 3 people who'd lost everything were about to discover what they'd found instead. In the distance, Alexander could see a figure waiting by a federal vehicle, tall, graying, wearing a smile Alexander hadn't seen in 20 years. His father, alive, waiting, ready to help build something better from the ashes of what they'd burned down. What happens now? Emma asked. Alexander looked at the woman who'd taught him to feel again, at the grandmother who'd nearly destroyed them trying to save them, at the father who'd spent 5 years in hiding to give them this moment of justice. Now we figure out how to build a life based on who we're choosing to become instead of who we've been manipulated to be. Emma smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her all night. That sounds impossible. Good, Alexander replied, pulling her closer as they walked toward whatever came next. I'm getting tired of possible. Impossible might be exactly what we need. Behind them, the warehouse burned with evidence of a corrupt empire. Ahead of them, the sunrise painted everything in shades of possibility. And between them, love, messy, uncertain, complicated love, proved once again that the most powerful force in the world wasn't money or manipulation, but the choice to keep caring about each other despite every reason not to. 6 months later, Alexander stood in a community center that had once been a Kane Corp foreclosure target, watching Emma teach art to children whose families had been saved by their midnight broadcast. Sunlight streamed through windows that federal restitution had replaced, illuminating faces that should have been scattered to shelters but instead glowed with the confidence of kids who knew they were home. Mr. Alexander. 7-year-old Maria tugged on his sleeve, holding up a drawing of a house with impossible purple trees and a family of stick figures holding hands. Look what Miss Emma taught us. Alexander knelt to Maria's level, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have known how to talk to a child. Now, surrounded by the families his former company had tried to destroy, he found himself learning a different kind of success metric. Tell me about your purple trees, he said, giving Maria his complete attention. Miss Emma says artists get to choose what color the world should be, Maria explained seriously. So I made the trees purple because purple is brave. Purple is definitely brave, Alexander agreed, glancing toward the corner where Emma was helping elderly Mr. Rodriguez paint his first landscape in 40 years. The community center buzzed with the kind of energy Alexander had never experienced in corporate boardrooms. Not the sharp competitiveness of people trying to take from each other, but the generous creativity of people building something together. Alexander. His father's voice came from behind him, still carrying the warmth that had made James Kane legendary among his employees before Blackstone's corruption. Alexander stood, the movement still feeling miraculous 6 months after that first reunion outside the warehouse. Dad, how did the housing board meeting go? Riverside Development Project is officially converted to community-owned cooperative housing. 800 families will have affordable homes with ownership stakes instead of corporate landlords. The news should have felt like pure victory, but Alexander had learned that real change came with complicated emotions. And the investors who lost money? Some are angry. Some are pursuing legal action. Some have asked about investing in the cooperative model. James Cain studied his son's face with the careful attention of someone still learning to read the man his boy had become. How are you handling the guilt? It was a question James asked regularly, understanding that Alexander's transformation from corporate destroyer to community builder hadn't come without psychological cost. Better, Alexander said honestly. Emma's been helping me understand the difference between responsibility and self-torture. As if summoned by her name, Emma appeared beside them, paint smudged on her cheek and lighting up her entire face. 6 months of stability, regular meals, safe housing, art supplies that didn't come from dumpsters, had transformed her from someone surviving day by day into someone building dreams for the future. The mural's almost finished, she announced, gesturing toward the wall where she'd been working with community volunteers. Wanna see? Alexander followed Emma to a wall that had been blank when they'd started renovating the community center. Now it blazed with color, a timeline of the neighborhood's history that began with immigrant families building homes and ended with those same families' descendants creating art, starting businesses, raising children who felt safe enough to paint purple trees. But in the center of the mural, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, was a small scene of 2 people sitting at a diner table, hands almost touching across chipped formica. You painted us, Alexander said quietly. I painted the moment everything changed, Emma corrected. Not because you saved me or I saved you, but because we chose to be honest with each other despite every reason not to trust. Alexander studied the tiny painted figures, remembering that first conversation when Emma had looked at his sadness and offered understanding instead of judgment. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met differently? Without all the manipulation and orchestration. Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same artistic intensity she brought to everything else. I think we would have walked past each other on the street and never spoken. You would have been too protected by wealth, and I would have been too protected by invisibility. So Blackstone's manipulation actually gave us a chance to meet when we were both vulnerable enough to see each other clearly. Emma's voice carried no bitterness, just the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd learned to find meaning in suffering. I can hate his methods while being grateful for the outcome. From across the room, Rose called out, Emma, can you come help Mrs. Patterson with her color mixing? The relationship between Emma and her grandmother had healed slowly, built on honest conversations about manipulation, protection, and the difference between love and control. Rose now volunteered at the community center, teaching sewing classes and slowly rebuilding trust with the granddaughter she'd nearly lost through misguided schemes. Go, Alexander said, squeezing Emma's paint-stained hand. I want to talk to Dad for a minute. Emma kissed his cheek, a casual gesture that still sent electricity through Alexander's nervous system, and headed toward Mrs. Patterson. She's remarkable, James Cain said, watching Emma patiently guide an elderly woman through watercolor techniques. She is. And she's choosing to build a life with someone who spent 15 years destroying communities like this one. Alexander's voice carried ongoing amazement at Emma's capacity for forgiveness. People aren't the sum of their worst decisions, son. They're the sum of their choices about who to become next. Alexander looked around the community center, at families whose evictions had been reversed, at children learning that art could transform any space into something beautiful, at elderly residents sharing skills they'd thought no one valued anymore. What we've built here, Alexander said, it's not enough to balance what Cain Corp destroyed over the years. No, James agreed. It's not, but it's a start, and it's built on a foundation of authentic connection rather than financial extraction. Through the window, Alexander could see the construction site where Cain Corp's former headquarters was being converted into affordable housing. The irony wasn't lost on him. The building where he'd once signed papers destroying communities was now becoming homes for the families those papers had displaced. The financial investigation wrapped up yesterday, James said. Blackstone's facing 43 felony counts. Most of his assets are being liquidated for victim restitution. And our assets? Gone mostly. Between legal fees, restitution payments, and community investment, we're essentially starting over financially. Alexander nodded, feeling something that would have terrified his old self. Complete peace with being broke. Emma and I found an apartment in the Riverside development. 2 bedrooms, shared kitchen, neighbors who borrow sugar and actually return it. That's a considerable downgrade from your penthouse. It's the considerable upgrade I've ever made. James Cain smiled. The expression his son remembered from childhood, before corporate pressure had hardened both their hearts. Your mother would be proud. The mention of his mother brought the familiar ache, but also something new. The knowledge that her death had meaning because it had eventually led to justice for all of Blackstone's victims. Dad, Alexander said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Always. The night in the warehouse. Emma's surveillance documentation, my emotional reactions, even my decision to trigger the broadcast. How much of that was planned by you? James Cain was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. I planned for Blackstone to eventually create a situation where you'd have to choose between your conscience and your company. I knew that when that moment came, you'd choose correctly because you're your mother's son as much as mine. But Emma was never part of any plan. Her grandmother came to me when Rose was diagnosed with cancer, asking for help protecting her granddaughter from Blackstone's influence. Faking Rose's death was intended to keep Emma completely out of corporate politics. Alexander felt relief flooding through him. So Emma and I really did meet by chance. You met by choice, James corrected. Your choice to walk away from the office instead of signing foreclosure papers. Emma's choice to show kindness to a stranger who looked lost. Those weren't accidents or manipulation. They were authentic human responses to moral crisis. Emma returned to them, her conversation with Mrs. Patterson having resulted in both women being covered in watercolor paint. What are you two talking about so seriously? She asked. Whether our love story is real or constructed, Alexander said with a smile. Emma considered this with mock seriousness. Well, let's see. You're broke. I'm still figuring out how to trust people. We're living in a 2-bedroom apartment with neighbors who play music too loud. And yesterday we had our first real fight about whose turn it was to do dishes. Your point. Fairy tale romance is perfect and easy. Real love is messy and requires constant choice. Emma's grin was radiant. I'm pretty sure what we have is real. Alexander pulled Emma closer, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. What were you and Mrs. Patterson discussing so intently? She wants to commission a portrait of her late husband. Apparently, she's been saving money from her Social Security for months to pay for it. That's wonderful. It is. And it got me thinking about something. Emma's expression grew thoughtful. I want to start a program where community members can commission portraits of lost loved ones. Not expensive formal paintings, but personal, meaningful art that helps people process grief. Alexander felt his heart swell with pride and love. That's brilliant. How can I help? Well, we'd need space, supplies, maybe some basic business structure. Consider it done. Emma laughed. Alexander, we don't have money for business ventures. No, but we have something better. We have community connections, volunteer labor, and the kind of authentic mission that attracts grants and donations. James Cain had been listening with growing interest. What you're describing sounds like social entrepreneurship, building businesses that prioritize community benefit over profit extraction. Is that what we're doing? Emma asked. It's what you've been doing since the day you chose to expose Blackstone instead of accepting his contracts, Alexander replied. You've been building an economy based on caring about people instead of exploiting them. Emma was quiet for a moment, her artist's mind clearly working through possibilities. You know what? Let's do it. Let's start a business that helps people process loss through art. Not to get rich, but to build something meaningful. Alexander felt the last piece of his old identity finally falling away. Partners. Partners. They shook hands with mock formality, then dissolved into laughter when Emma's paint-covered palm left multicolored fingerprints on Alexander's shirt. There's something else, James Cain said. The federal investigation into corporate surveillance has expanded beyond Blackstone. Congress is considering legislation that would require transparency in all corporate intelligence operations. Because of what we exposed? Emma asked. Because you proved that corporate surveillance can be dismantled by people who care more about justice than job security. Alexander looked around the community center, at families rebuilding their lives, at children learning that their neighborhoods were worth investing in, at elderly residents sharing wisdom that corporate efficiency had tried to discard. Dad, he said quietly, do you think we did the right thing? Really? All those Cain Corp employees who lost their jobs, the investors who lost money, the economic disruption, was it worth it? James Cain followed his son's gaze, taking in the scene of genuine community that had replaced corporate extraction. "Ask me in 10 years, James said. When these children are grown, when this cooperative housing model has spread to other neighborhoods, when the families we saved have had time to build generational wealth instead of just paying rent to corporate landlords." But the immediate cost was real. People suffered because of our choices, just like people suffered because of Blackstone's choices. The difference is that our choices were designed to transfer suffering from the powerless to the powerful, while his were designed to do the opposite. Emma took Alexander's hand, grounding him in the present moment. "Alexander, you can't save everyone, but you can choose to keep trying to save someone. Every day, with every decision, you can choose to be the person who cares more about community than profit. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." As the afternoon wound down, families began gathering their children and their artwork, heading home to apartments that federal intervention had saved and community organizing had improved. Alexander watched them go, marveling at how different this felt from watching employees leave Kane Corp offices. There was no exhaustion here, no desperate competition, no sense that tomorrow would bring fresh battles for survival. Just the satisfied tiredness of people who'd spent their day building something together. "Emma," Alexander said as they cleaned paint brushes and stored art supplies, "I have something to tell you." "What?" Alexander pulled out a small velvet box that had been burning a hole in his pocket for weeks. But instead of getting down on one knee, he sat beside Emma on the paint-splattered floor. "This isn't a proposal," he said quickly, seeing her eyes widen. "This is a promise." Emma opened the box to find not a diamond ring, but a simple silver band engraved with words only she would understand. "Purple is brave." "Alexander," Emma whispered, tears starting to flow. "I promise to keep choosing you, every day, even when I'm not sure if my feelings are authentic or programmed. I promise to keep becoming someone worthy of your faith in human goodness. And I promise that if you ever want to make this official, marriage, partnership, whatever you want to call it, it'll be because we both choose it freely, not because circumstances force us together." Emma slipped the ring onto her finger, where it caught the late afternoon light streaming through windows that had been installed with federal restitution money. "Purple is brave," she said softly. "And so is love that admits it might be imperfect. So is choosing to build something together despite uncertainty. So is believing that people can change." They sat on the floor of a community center that had been built from the ashes of corporate greed, surrounded by art created by people who'd been written off as expendable, wearing paint stains like badges of honor. "What happens next?" Emma asked. Alexander looked at this woman who'd taught him that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the depth of connection you built with people around you. "Next, we go home to our 2-bedroom apartment and figure out whose turn it is to cook dinner. Next, we wake up tomorrow and choose each other again. Next, we keep building something real in a world that profits from fake connections. And after that, we trust that love, messy, uncertain, constantly chosen love, is strong enough to create the kind of world where children feel safe enough to paint purple trees." Emma kissed him then, soft and certain and real, while around them the community center settled into evening quiet. Outside, streetlights began to glow in a neighborhood that had been saved not by corporate charity, but by people who'd chosen justice over profit. In the distance, construction continued on the housing cooperative that would give 800 families ownership stakes in their own community. Closer, families gathered for dinner in apartments that federal intervention had preserved and tenant organizing had improved. And in a paint-splattered community center, where corporate surveillance had once documented human lives for exploitation, 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage of manipulation held each other close and planned tomorrow's choices. The cold millionaire CEO who had never loved anyone had learned that the warmest wealth came from choosing to care about people despite every reason not to trust. The poor beggar girl who'd survived on hope alone had discovered that the richest life came from building something meaningful with someone who'd grown worthy of her faith. Together, they'd proven that love, real, complicated, constantly chosen love, was stronger than money, more powerful than manipulation, and brave enough to paint the world any color it chose. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of 8 million people making choices about how to treat each other. Some chose extraction, some chose connection. Some chose profit, some chose people. But in one small community center, the choice had been made clearly. In a world that tried to turn everything into a commodity, some things remained beautifully, stubbornly, and profitably human. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. What did this story teach you about the power of choosing authentic connection over material security and the courage it takes to rebuild your life based on who you want to become rather than who you've been manipulated to be? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.